My son banned me from his wedding but sent me a bill for $100,000 to pay for the wedding and honeymoon. When I first read those words, I thought I was seeing things. The sentence echoed in my mind, refusing to let go. How could this happen? How could my own son, the one I raised and loved for so many years, treat me like this? And then the bill, a staggering $100,000. Money I never asked for and never expected. I held the invoice in my hands, the weight of it more than just paper. It felt as if something invisible but heavy was crushing my chest. Each word, each line in the letter wasn't just shocking, it felt like betrayal. The letter read, "Dad, thanks for everything you've done for me. However, this wedding isn't for you. We've decided to handle everything ourselves, to ensure everything goes smoothly. We've made a detailed plan for the wedding and honeymoon. Therefore, please pay the $100,000 to cover the costs." The more I read it, the more I couldn't understand. How could my son ask me to pay a fortune for a wedding that I wasn't even invited to? This wasn't just about money. It was about disrespect. It was about ignoring the love and sacrifices I'd made for him over the years. All the effort, all the sleepless nights. All the years of support, did they mean nothing? My mind flashed back to the years I spent raising Evan. From when he was a child to when he grew up, I was always there for him, always protecting him, always teaching him how to navigate life. I remember the countless evenings I spent with him, sharing stories about family, love, and the importance of respect. And now, here he was, asking me to pay for his wedding. A wedding that he didn't even want me to be a part of. How could this happen? Why is this happening? The question rang in my mind again and again. The emotions surged: anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of abandonment. His wedding, a moment that should have been full of joy and celebration, had turned into a cruel punch to the gut. But what scared me even more was that I couldn't change any of it. What had happened? Why was Evan doing this? I stared at the bill. The $100,000 glaring at me, and then out the window. The trees outside swayed gently in the wind, the sunlight streaming through the room, but everything felt different now. I didn't recognize myself anymore. How was I supposed to face my son when our relationship had been shattered so deeply? A quiet morning, and yet I couldn't bring myself to move. The bill and the letter still lay on the table, the light from the bedside lamp casting a faint glow on them, a reminder of a future that had changed. I couldn't focus, couldn't think. The pain inside was suffocating. I looked at the watch on my wrist, wondering if my son remembered all the years we'd spent together, the struggles we'd faced as a family, or was it all just a distant memory now, overshadowed by his own agenda? I kept asking myself, wondering if I could keep silent, do nothing, as my son was hurting me so deeply. Could I talk to him, explain that I hadn't done anything wrong? Could I fix this, or would I have to accept this betrayal, one that I could never fully understand? All night long I couldn't sleep. The bill and the letter stayed on the table, the light from the lamp flickering softly, like a reminder of an unchangeable reality. The betrayal was too much. It felt like a noose tightening around my heart, slowly, relentlessly. When Evan was born, it was like the entire universe shifted into a different, more meaningful place. I wasn't prepared for the overwhelming love that would pour from my heart, nor the responsibility of raising a child into a man, but like most parents, I stepped up, and with every stage of Evan's life, I poured myself into him. I had been a single father for most of his childhood. His mother, well, that was a different story. We never talked much about her. She'd left when Evan was only 3. She took off with her own dreams, abandoning us in a cold and callous way. I often wondered what she was thinking when she walked out. It was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through, trying to be both father and mother. But despite the pain, I had one priority: Evan. He was the reason I woke up every morning and faced the world. He was my everything. I spent countless hours taking him to soccer practice, sitting through parent-teacher conferences, and listening to him complain about high school. I knew he was struggling with the absence of his mother, and I did everything I could to fill that gap, even though I was never quite sure if I was succeeding. But one thing I did know: I was there for him. Always. We had a bond, a deep one that was forged in the fire of hardship. Every birthday, every graduation, every success was something we celebrated together. Our home was never lavish, but it was filled with love. I didn't have much, but I gave Evan everything I could, and that's all that mattered, or so I thought. I wanted the best for Evan. I pushed him to pursue his dreams, to study hard, to be the kind of man who wouldn't settle for mediocrity. I wasn't perfect, but I thought I was giving him a roadmap to life to help him avoid the pitfalls I fell into. I worked hard to ensure he could go to college, have a better life than I did. I wanted him to feel that everything he wanted was within his reach, but as the years passed, I began to notice subtle changes. The young boy I knew seemed to be replaced by someone else, someone more distant. The first signs came during his college years when he became more withdrawn. When I asked him about it, he shrugged it off, saying he was just busy with school. But the truth was more complex. He was starting to drift. One evening, we sat down to dinner, and he finally opened up about the pressure he felt. Dad, I don't know anymore. Everything I do seems to disappoint you. You're always pushing me for more. I'm trying, but it's like nothing I do is ever good enough. I tried to reassure him. I never meant to make him feel like a failure. I told him, Evan, I'm proud of you no matter what, but I know you can do even better. The words left my mouth before I even thought about how they sounded. I didn't want to admit it, but there was an underlying truth that both of us knew. I had expectations, high ones. And sometimes I pushed too hard. I just wanted him to have a better life than I did. Then came the news that would change everything. Evan had found someone. It was supposed to be a joyful occasion. I remember when he introduced her to me for the first time. Her name was Melissa, and she seemed so perfect for him. She was everything he'd ever wanted, smart, beautiful, and kind. They looked happy together. I thought it would be the perfect match. The wedding was planned in a beautiful vineyard in Napa Valley. The picturesque location was straight out of a dream. I knew it would be a day to remember, not just for Evan, but for all of us. Melissa was a great match for him. She was everything I could have hoped for. But then, as the wedding plans unfolded, things began to feel off. I wasn't included in the planning. At first, I thought it was just because I wasn't very involved with the details, but soon I began to realize that my role in the wedding was much smaller than I had anticipated. They kept the details vague, the invitations less personal, and I was never fully clued in. I told myself it was just part of the process, the couple wanting their independence. But there were moments of silence when I saw Evan's distant look, and I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. Was this a sign of things to come, or just normal pre-wedding jitters? Melissa's family was wealthy, well-connected, and powerful. Their presence at the wedding was a contrast to our own modest family. The disparity was clear, the way they carried themselves, their expectations for the day, their comments that subtly hinted at how things should be done. I tried to stay out of it, but it was hard. Melissa's mother especially seemed to have a knack for making me feel invisible. She would talk about the finer things in life, always drawing attention to her lavish lifestyle, which only made me feel like I didn't belong. Her carefully chosen words, though always polite, felt like they were meant to highlight how different we were. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. This was Evan's day, not mine. But as the wedding day approached, something inside me began to stir. The growing tension in the air felt suffocating. I thought about the moments we shared as a family, the connection we had, and how somehow it was slipping through my fingers. The days leading up to the wedding passed quickly, but the unease continued to simmer. I kept wondering why I hadn't been asked for help with the wedding arrangements, why I felt so isolated from the process. But I told myself that it was just a phase and that things would be fine. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my suit. I looked at myself, seeing the years etched into my face. I'd put everything I had into raising Evan, and yet now I was standing on the sidelines, watching him step into a new chapter of his life, one where I felt I had no place. The invitation had come, but it felt more like a formality than a heartfelt gesture. I tried to push those thoughts aside, but it wasn't easy. Something was wrong and I couldn't put my finger on it, and then it happened. The call came early in the morning, just as I was preparing to leave for the wedding. It was Evan, my son. The words he spoke to me shattered everything. Dad, there's something I need to tell you. I've been thinking about it, and I don't think you should come to the wedding today. I felt the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My mind raced, trying to understand what he was saying. What do you mean? I asked, my voice shaky. I'm sorry, he said. It's not going to work out. This is what we've decided. And just like that, the bond I thought we had, the years of love and sacrifice, were reduced to nothing. I had been banished from my own son's wedding, and then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the bill came. A staggering, impossible to ignore sum of $100,000 for the wedding and honeymoon expenses. It was a slap in the face, a final, crushing blow that left me speechless. Now, as I sat in the empty room looking at the bill, a storm of emotions raged inside me: betrayal, confusion, anger, and pain. I could barely process the pain of losing my son, of being told I didn't belong in his life anymore. And then there was the realization that this was the final chapter, not just of our relationship, but of everything I had worked for, believed in, and hoped for. The silence in the room was deafening. The letter from Evan lay on the table, mocking me with its coldness. What had gone wrong? How had we ended up here? As I stared at the bill, the answer seemed as clear as day. I had been replaced by money, by appearances, by a life that had nothing to do with the father who had raised him. And now, the only thing left to do was face this truth and figure out how to survive the fallout. The call came that morning like a slap in the face, and I hadn't expected it. In fact, I had been numb for the past few days. The idea of Evan telling me not to come to his wedding was still fresh in my mind, lingering like a bad taste I couldn't wash away. That was one thing, rejection, but the bill, that was a cruel twist, something I couldn't have anticipated. I tried to hold on to some semblance of composure, to understand why Evan was doing this. But I couldn't find the answers. My son, telling me that I wasn't welcome at his wedding, that everything I had poured into him, the sacrifices, the years of love and devotion, meant nothing anymore, was beyond my understanding. I felt like a stranger in my own life. The silence from Evan was deafening. A few weeks had passed since the phone call, and I had yet to hear from him. It wasn't like him to just shut me out, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't yet uncovered. The bill, an incomprehensible demand for $100,000, was just the surface of a much deeper fracture in our relationship. Every time I looked at it, my mind raced. How could he do this to me? How could the son I raised with love and care suddenly throw me away without so much as a word of explanation? Days passed, and I felt the weight of my loneliness bearing down on me. I had done everything for him, and yet here I was, left to pick up the pieces of a broken relationship that I hadn't seen coming. Then, on a day I least expected, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat as I slowly made my way to the door, unsure of who would be standing on the other side. When I opened it, there was Evan. His face was grim, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't been sleeping. For a moment, the world seemed to stop as I processed what I was seeing. My son, the one who had rejected me, was standing on my doorstep, looking like a ghost of the person I once knew. I didn't know whether to hug him or push him away. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "can we talk?" I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. There was so much I wanted to say: anger, confusion, pain, but I didn't, not yet. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing where to begin. Finally, Evan broke the silence. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice strained. "I messed everything up. I've been thinking about it for weeks." "I'm sorry." My heart dropped at the word sorry. It was a word I hadn't heard from him in a long time, and even then it felt hollow. I couldn't tell if he meant it, or if this was just a convenient apology to ease his guilt. "You don't have to apologize," I replied, my voice tight. "What I don't understand, Evan, is why. Why did you do this? Why push me away? I've been here for you your whole life. I raised you. I gave up everything to make sure you had everything you needed." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't place, but it wasn't regret. It was something darker, something that made me feel like I didn't know him at all. "I didn't want you there," he said quietly. "Not at the wedding, not at all." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I was stunned, my breath catching in my throat. Not at the wedding. It was one thing to be told I wasn't welcome, but it was another to hear that my presence was an active choice for him, something he didn't want. I struggled to keep my composure, but I could feel the tears threatening to spill. "You don't want me there, but I'm your father. I'm your family," I said, the desperation creeping into my voice. "I raised you to be better than this, Evan. I loved you. I loved you enough to make sacrifices for you. And now you're telling me I'm not enough, that I don't matter." Evan's face contorted with pain, as if he was struggling with something deep inside. "It's not about you, Dad. It's about me. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I've ever known. I thought I wanted the wedding, the life with Melissa, but I've been so caught up in what everyone else wanted that I lost sight of what I needed." His words made no sense. I wanted to understand, to make sense of this sudden shift. But I was too clouded with my own pain to hear him clearly. I was too wrapped up in the betrayal to process anything else. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I had to do it," he continued. I had to figure this out on my own, and I thought if I pushed you away, I could have some space to breathe, to figure out who I really am. Evan's confession left me reeling. I had spent so many years thinking that I had given him everything: love, attention, direction. But now I realized that it was never about the things I gave him. It was about the things I couldn't give him, the things I didn't even know he needed. There was a profound silence between us, the kind that only happens when everything you thought you knew is called into question. I had tried to be the best father I could, but the reality was that I had missed something vital. In my attempts to raise Evan with the right values, I hadn't taken the time to listen to his heart. I had been too focused on my own expectations, on the life I wanted for him, to truly understand his. But now it was too late. The betrayal wasn't just that he had rejected me from his wedding, or that he had sent me a bill for the expenses. It was that he had been carrying this weight for so long, and I had never noticed. I had never taken the time to ask him the right questions, to give him the space he needed to figure things out. I sat there, struggling to process everything. My son, the one I had loved and raised, had become a stranger to me. The man who had once looked up to me, who had trusted me, now felt distant and disconnected. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, suffocating me in its finality. When Evan left that day, I was left alone with my thoughts. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence louder than it had ever been. I had to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't the father I thought I was. I wasn't the parent Evan needed, and for the first time in my life, I felt utterly powerless. I sat in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to find meaning in the chaos. How had things gone so wrong? Why hadn't I seen the signs? Why hadn't I listened when it mattered? The weight of the $100,000 bill on the table mocked me, but it was no longer just about the money. It was about a life lost, a relationship that had been irreparably damaged. And as I looked out the window, I realized that I couldn't fix this, not by myself. But something inside me shifted. Something deep and primal. I couldn't give up on my son, not like this. I would have to fight for him, fight for what we once had. And even if that meant I had to change everything I thought I knew about being a father, I would do it. I couldn't undo the betrayal, but I could rewrite the next chapter. Days passed after Evan's visit, but the silence between us hung heavier than ever. I tried reaching out to him once, twice, but each call went unanswered. It was as if I was trying to touch someone through glass, unable to bridge the chasm that had formed between us. The $100,000 bill was the physical embodiment of the distance now separating us. I could feel the paper beneath my fingers every time I looked at it. But it wasn't just the money that hurt. It was the sense of being discarded, as if my entire existence, my love, my sacrifices, the years I had spent raising Evan had no value anymore. I began to wonder, was there any way to fix this? Could I ever reach my son again, or had he already made up his mind to leave me behind? I couldn't breathe with the weight of these questions pressing down on me. I felt lost. Every part of my life seemed to crumble. And I had no idea where to turn. All my actions, all the love I thought I had given him had been thrown aside, leaving me hollow and empty. I spent hours in the empty house, staring at the walls, replaying every moment that led up to this. The wedding, the rejection, the bill. The guilt weighed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I should have seen it coming. I should have done more, been more present. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this hopeless. Each day was a blur of silence and regret, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on anything else, my mind kept returning to Evan. I would go to work, trying to act normal, but inside I was falling apart. At night, when I lay awake in bed, the weight of the $100,000 bill gnawed at my thoughts, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. I tried to reach out to Melissa, thinking maybe she could help bridge the gap between us. But when I called her, she didn't answer. I left her a message, but she never called back. I began to feel the isolation sinking in deeper. My world had become a solitary existence, one where I no longer recognized the person I had become. I called my brother one evening, hoping to find solace in his voice, but when he picked up, I couldn't even find the words. There was nothing to say that would fix this. No words of comfort would make the pain go away. I didn't even know how to explain it to him. The guilt and shame were suffocating. I wondered what I had done wrong, where I had gone wrong. Had I been too controlling, too demanding, too absent when he needed me the most? The thoughts spiraled, and the more I tried to stop them, the more they consumed me. I was trapped inside my own mind, a prisoner of my mistakes. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning, a quiet, overcast day. I had spent the night lying awake, tossing and turning, my mind a whirl of doubt and frustration. The weight of everything that had happened since the wedding rejection felt unbearable, and that's when it hit me. I had to face the reality of what Evan's rejection truly meant. He had shut me out, and he had done so without hesitation. No words, no explanation, just a cold, final decision that I was no longer part of his life. I was no longer welcome. In that moment, I realized that I couldn't keep living in denial. I couldn't pretend that everything would be okay. I was losing my son, and I couldn't stop it. He had made a choice. And I had to face the consequences of that choice. I could no longer ignore the fact that this was the end of a chapter, a painful, heartbreaking end. I took the bill from the table, staring at it for what seemed like an eternity. I had no idea how I was going to pay it. The thought of paying for a wedding I wasn't even invited to felt absurd, but it was more than that. It was the symbol of everything I had lost. Evan had wanted me to pay for a day he didn't want me to be a part of. The whole situation felt like a twisted joke when I wasn't sure how to laugh at. I walked to the window, my hand resting on the sill, my eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The world outside seemed so distant, so out of reach. How could I have gotten here? How could I have lost everything I cared about? The thought of it was overwhelming. The pain felt physical, like a tight knot in my chest that wouldn't loosen no matter how hard I tried. I could barely breathe as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I had always believed in the strength of family, in the unshakable bond between a parent and child. But now, standing in the ruins of my relationship with Evan, I wasn't so sure anymore. Was family really everything, or was it just another illusion? I stumbled back to the couch, feeling the weight of the room pressing down. I didn't have the energy to cry anymore, though my eyes burned. All I had left was a numbness that wouldn't go away. But in that moment of pure despair, a realization began to creep in, a small spark of clarity amidst the overwhelming pain. I could sit here consumed by guilt and regret, letting the weight of my mistakes crush me, or I could fight. I could do something about this. I could fight for Evan, for the relationship we had. It wouldn't be easy. I didn't even know where to begin, but I couldn't keep sitting in this misery, waiting for Evan to come back to me. I stood up from the couch, wiping my eyes. I had to do something, anything, to start fixing this. I had to face my son. No matter how broken things had become, but first I needed to forgive myself. I needed to stop blaming myself for every decision, every mistake, every misstep. It wasn't just my fault. Evan had his own reasons, his own choices. I couldn't carry the weight of his decisions forever, and so, with a deep breath, I made a decision. I would fight for my son, but I would do it on my own terms. I would stop being the broken man sitting alone in the dark. I would stand up, face my mistakes, and take the first step toward rebuilding what had been destroyed. The breakdown had been painful, yes, but it had opened my eyes to the reality of the situation. It was the moment where everything seemed lost, but in the depths of that despair, I realized that it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new, something I didn't understand yet, but I was willing to face it head on. I didn't know how the story would end. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't done fighting. It wasn't a single event or an epiphany that shifted everything for me. It wasn't a grand moment of realization, nor was it a dramatic conversation that changed the course of my life. It was the silence, the quiet moments that had been so overwhelming, so suffocating, that I found myself learning to listen to them instead of fighting against them. As I sat in my dimly lit living room, the weight of the past months pressing against my chest, I realized something fundamental. The pain that I had been carrying for so long, the anger, the shame, they had all come from one simple belief I held. I was the cause of this suffering. But what if I wasn't? What if I wasn't responsible for everything that had gone wrong? What if my choices, my mistakes, had only been a small part of a much larger story? The realization settled over me like a soft fog, quiet but thick. The answer wasn't in blaming myself for everything that had happened with Evan. The answer was in letting go of that weight. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to sit with the feelings I had been avoiding. I didn't try to push them away. I didn't distract myself with work, with people, with anything that could take my mind off the painful truth. I allowed myself to feel the sadness, the guilt, the regret, but I didn't let them consume me. Instead, I listened to them, let them speak, and understood that they were a part of me. But not the definition of me. I started keeping a journal. At first, it was just small things, fragments of thoughts, memories I didn't want to forget, observations about my day, but slowly it became more. I began to write down my feelings. I wrote about my fear of losing Evan forever, about the emptiness that had followed me for months, and about the bitterness that I had clung to, convinced it was the only way to deal with the hurt. But in time, the bitterness began to fade. As I wrote, I realized that I had the power to shape how I saw my own story. I didn't need to be the villain. I didn't need to hold onto the blame. I could choose to forgive both myself and Evan. As the days passed, I found myself revisiting the past, not as a means to wallow in regret, but as a way to understand. I began to see my mistakes not as monumental failures, but as human errors, things everyone experiences. I was just a person trying my best in a situation that was beyond my control. I thought back to the times when I tried so hard to protect Evan, to give him everything I thought he needed. I could see now that in my efforts to be everything for him, I had unintentionally pushed him away. I had thought that love meant giving him everything I could, but in doing so, I had neglected to give him the one thing he needed most: space. Evan had needed space to grow, to learn from his own experiences, and in trying to shield him from the world, I had robbed him of that. The guilt that I had felt for so long began to transform into a quiet understanding. I wasn't perfect, no one is, but that didn't make me a failure as a father. It was during one of my morning walks, the fresh air filling my lungs, that I felt the first true sense of clarity. I realized that I had been looking at everything through a lens of scarcity, believing that I could lose everything and that nothing would ever be the same again. But what if the opposite were true? What if the loss wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of something else? In that moment, I understood that this pain, this rupture between Evan and me, could become the catalyst for my own transformation. It didn't have to be the defining chapter of my life. It didn't have to be a permanent wound. I could choose to heal. The shift wasn't immediate. It didn't happen all at once. But over time, I began to accept that I couldn't change the past. And I couldn't control the future, but I could control how I responded. I could let go of the need for validation, the need for closure, the need for Evan to see things my way. What mattered now was how I chose to live. I stopped waiting for Evan to come to me, stopped holding onto the hope that he would apologize or understand. I realized that I didn't need his approval to move forward. I didn't need him to fix what had been broken. I was the one who needed to fix myself. I started making small changes, little things, but they meant everything. I stopped trying to make amends for the past, and instead I focused on building a future where I could be proud of who I was. I took up a new hobby, something I had always wanted to do but had put aside in the chaos of life: painting. It wasn't about the skill, it was about the act of creation, of expressing something deeper inside me that I had been unable to voice for so long. I also began reconnecting with old friends, the ones I had pushed away because I had been too absorbed in my own struggles. I found solace in their company, in the simple joy of being seen and heard, and little by little I began to rebuild my life, one small piece at a time. By the time the summer ended, I had a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. I still thought about Evan every day, still missed him, but I no longer allowed the pain to define me. I understood that this was a journey, not just a chapter in my life. The healing wasn't linear. And there were days when I felt the old pangs of regret, but they didn't hold me captive anymore. I had learned to let go. And one day, unexpectedly, I received a call. It was from Evan. He didn't apologize. He didn't say much at all. But in his voice, I heard something that I hadn't heard in months: softness, openness, a willingness to talk. I didn't force anything. I didn't rush him. I simply listened as he began to share his own journey, his own struggles, and his own healing. The phone call wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't the instant reunion I had once dreamed of, but it was the beginning of something new, a slow, cautious rebuilding of trust, not just between us, but within myself. The shift that had happened within me was beginning to take root in our relationship, and though it would take time, I knew now that there was hope. The weeks had passed with a quiet but steady sense of healing, and in that time something had changed within me. I had regained the control that I thought I had lost. No longer would I sit idly by and wait for the past to fade into memory. I had spent too long letting life unfold around me without ever taking a stand. It was time to reclaim my own narrative. The turning point came when I stumbled upon a document, a letter I had long forgotten. Buried under a pile of old papers, it was from the legal team representing the company that had wronged me, a betrayal that had played a key role in the unraveling of my relationship with Evan. The letter contained a clause I hadn't noticed before, a loophole that, if I pursued it, could lead to the justice I so desperately craved. That moment was a turning point. I knew that if I wanted to right the wrongs, I had to act. It wasn't about revenge, it was about regaining what I had lost and taking back my dignity. It was time to confront the people who had been a part of my downfall. The first step in my plan was simple. I hired a lawyer, a fierce, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in corporate litigation. She had a reputation for taking on large companies and winning. This wasn't about taking on the world. It was about confronting a specific enemy, the ones who had taken advantage of my trust and manipulated me for their gain. My lawyer, Susan, was pragmatic and direct. She quickly saw what I had missed all those years, the things that, in my desperation to avoid conflict, I had chosen to ignore. It was almost as if I had been blinded by my own need to move past the pain, to avoid further confrontation. But now, with a clear mind and an unwavering sense of justice, I could see the way forward. We began preparing a case that would change everything. It wasn't about money or fame, it was about restoring the balance that had been tipped so unfairly. As the weeks passed, my confidence grew. I no longer felt like a victim. I was no longer paralyzed by fear. I had a plan, and I would see it through. The day of the confrontation arrived. I stood outside the large glass building, staring up at the gleaming exterior of the corporation that had played such a significant role in my life. It was ironic, a symbol of success, yet a place where the seeds of my downfall had been sown. As I walked through the front doors, I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't felt in years. Every step was a reminder of how far I had come. The man who had once been broken and lost was now standing tall, ready to claim what was rightfully his. The meeting with the company executives was tense, charged with an air of unspoken animosity. They had underestimated me before. They had thought that I was weak, a man who could be easily manipulated and pushed aside. But today they would learn that I was no longer the same person. I sat across from them, calm, composed, yet with an undercurrent of steely determination. My lawyer presented the case, dissecting every detail, every piece of evidence that had been collected over the past months. The executives, once so confident, began to shift in their seats, their earlier arrogance dissolving into something more palpable, fear. I could see it in their eyes. They were realizing that they had underestimated me. The tables had turned. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that I was going to win. The executives who had once seen me as a mere pawn in their game now saw me as a force to be reckoned with. They knew that the situation had spiraled out of their control, and there was nothing they could do to stop the legal juggernaut we had set in motion. But what was even more satisfying was the moment when they realized the true cost of their actions. I hadn't just been fighting for compensation or acknowledgement, I had been fighting for something much deeper: my integrity, my reputation, and my dignity. The settlement that was finally reached was unprecedented. It wasn't just a financial victory, it was a moral one. The corporation was forced to issue a public apology and change its policies to prevent similar injustices from happening again. They had been forced to acknowledge the harm they had caused, and they were being held accountable. As I walked out of the meeting room, I felt a sense of vindication that I had longed for. The weight that had been pressing on my shoulders for so long was finally lifted. But it wasn't just about the victory in the boardroom. It was about the victory within myself, the realization that I was no longer at the mercy of others. I had taken control of my own fate, and it felt liberating. After the legal battle, I turned my attention back to Evan. The road to reconciliation hadn't been easy, but the events of the past few months had brought us closer in a way that I hadn't anticipated. We had both been through a lot, but the pain had forged a bond between us that was unbreakable. It was during one of our conversations that Evan revealed something that made my heart swell with pride. He had been watching everything unfold, not just the legal battle, but the transformation within me. He had seen how I had taken charge of my life, how I had become stronger, and how I had refused to be broken by the past. "You were right," he said quietly. His voice filled with emotion. I should have never doubted you. I see now what you were trying to teach me all along. It's not about the fight. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter what. Those words were more than just an apology. They were a recognition of the journey I had been on, a journey of growth and resilience. The final act of payback wasn't some grand revenge, nor was it a public spectacle. It was the quiet, profound realization that I had reclaimed everything that had been taken from me, not through anger or retaliation, but through self-empowerment. The justice I had fought for wasn't just external, it was internal as well. And as I looked at Evan standing there before me with a new sense of respect, I realized that in the end, the greatest revenge wasn't in the courtroom. It wasn't in winning the settlement or the apology. It was in the peace I had found within myself, and in knowing that I had taught my son the most important lesson of all, how to be strong in the face of adversity and how to stand tall when the world seems to be against you. As I sat by the window in my study, the soft light of the evening sun casting a golden hue over the room, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The journey had been long, often painful, and sometimes even overwhelming, but in the silence that now enveloped me, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from external victories or applause, but the kind of peace that settled deep within the soul after a storm had passed, leaving nothing but the stillness in its wake. I had fought for so much, for justice, for closure, for the restoration of my dignity, but now in this moment of calm, I realized that the most important thing I had found was something that couldn't be measured by victories or material gains. It was a deeper understanding of myself and the resilience I never knew I had. It was the quiet realization that I could face the world, not with the scars of the past, but with the strength of someone who had endured and overcome. The battles with the corporation, with the people who had betrayed me, with my own sense of worth, they were all now part of the past. They were chapters in a book I no longer needed to keep reading. The future stretched out before me like an open road, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to walk down it without looking over my shoulder. One of the most profound shifts had been in my relationship with Evan. When the journey began, he had been a man adrift, unsure of his place in the world and even more uncertain about his place in my life. His doubts and insecurities had mirrored my own, and while I had focused on my own redemption, I hadn't realized that his was also a journey of growth. After the confrontation, after the legal battles and the revelations, Evan and I found ourselves in a place we hadn't been in for years, a place of mutual respect and understanding. He had learned not just to admire my strength, but to understand it. He had learned what it meant to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy, even when the world seems to conspire against you, and I had learned how to trust him again. Our relationship wasn't perfect, no relationship ever is, but it was real. It was grounded in the kind of honesty and strength that only comes from facing your own weaknesses and growing from them. There was no more pretending, no more unresolved anger, just two people standing side by side, ready to face whatever came next. As I watched him grow, I realized that the greatest lesson I had taught him wasn't in the courtroom or in the boardroom. It was in the quiet moments we shared, in the times when words weren't needed because we both understood what the other was feeling. It was in the way we had learned to trust each other again, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. But the greatest realization I had was that pain, while devastating, had a purpose. It wasn't something to be avoided or hidden from as I had once thought. Pain, in all its forms, had a way of revealing truths. It showed me who I was, what I was capable of, and what I needed to let go of in order to move forward. Healing wasn't a linear process. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the past seemed to threaten to pull me back into the darkness. But as I sat there, watching the evening unfold, I knew that I had reached a place of acceptance. I had accepted the pain, and more importantly, I had accepted myself. The people who had wronged me, the systems that had betrayed me, they no longer had power over me. I had taken my power back, and now I was free. It was ironic in a way. The journey had started with a feeling of helplessness, of being at the mercy of forces beyond my control, but it had ended with me standing tall, having regained everything I had lost and more. The pain had been the crucible in which my strength had been forged. One thing I hadn't anticipated was the emptiness that followed the resolution. The case was won, the apology was issued, and the legal battles were over. The tension that had hung over me for so long had dissipated, and yet there was an odd feeling of quiet that remained. It wasn't that I regretted the resolution, far from it, but in the wake of such intense conflict, it felt as if something was missing. Something had been left behind. In the past, I had thought that the pursuit of justice was what would make me whole again. I had thought that once I had achieved the impossible, once I had triumphed over those who had wronged me, I would be free of the past. But what I realized now was that the past wasn't something I could ever truly leave behind. It was a part of me, woven into the very fabric of who I had become. The emptiness I felt wasn't a lack of closure, it was the space created by the healing that had taken place. And it was in that space that I was finally able to breathe, to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it, learning from it, and growing from it. Now, as I sat in the stillness of my home, I could feel the wisdom settling in. The lessons learned, the battles fought, and the wisdom gained, they were all a part of me now. I wasn't the same person I had been before all of this. I had been through too much, seen too much, and grown too much to be the same. But I wasn't bitter, I wasn't angry, I was at peace, and for the first time in years I felt free. The journey had been long, and it had taken me to places I never thought I would go, but it had also brought me back to myself, back to a place of clarity and understanding. I had faced the darkness, confronted the pain, and emerged stronger than I had ever been before. And as I sat there in the quiet of my home, I knew that this was just the beginning. There were still many chapters to be written, many lessons to be learned, and many roads to travel, but for now I was content. The story of the past was no longer mine to tell. It was the story of the future that awaited me, a future that I would face with a clear heart, a steady mind, and the unwavering strength of someone who had learned how to rise above. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Your time and attention mean the world. And I truly appreciate you following along. Your support inspires me to continue sharing stories that resonate, heal, and empower. Until next time, take care and stay strong.